I will never forget that silence. Inside courtroom number 7 of the Hennepin County Courthouse, when Judge Robert Kincaid struck his gavel 3 times, strangely, I didn't feel joy nor victory. I only felt empty. The woman sitting at the defendant's table, Clarissa Ward, the daughter-in-law I once loved as my own flesh and blood, was trembling in her black suit. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair was now a tangled mess. Her blue eyes, once proud and confident, were swollen red from tears. $40,000, 8 months, $5,000 each month. That was the money my son Isaiah sent me so I could live comfortably in my old age. Yet for those 8 months, I, a 67-year-old widow, stood in line every Friday at the Pilgrim Baptist Church to receive food donations. I boiled water in an old kettle because my heater had broken during the bone-freezing Minneapolis winter. I counted every penny before buying a single can of soup. And Clarissa? She drove a brand-new Lexus and parked it right in front of my house. She wore a silk Chanel dress. She flew first class to Cancun with another man. All of it, paid for with my retirement money, paid for with my son's hard work. When the judge announced the verdict, Clarissa turned to look at me. 1 second, 2. In her eyes, there was no remorse, only shock, disbelief that a poor, frail old woman like me could defeat her. But Clarissa forgot one thing. I wasn't weak. I was waiting for the right moment, for the truth to reveal itself. And today, inside this courtroom, it finally did. My name is Mavis Grant, and this is the story of how an old mother, living on canned soup and the kindness of strangers, fought to reclaim not only the money stolen from her, but the dignity everyone thought she had lost with age. But to understand why I'm sitting here before a judge facing the daughter-in-law I once trusted like my own blood, I have to take you back to the beginning, to that Mother's Day, the day everything began to fall apart. If you've ever seen someone underestimate a mother's silence, stay. This story is for you. Hit subscribe so you won't miss the true stories, lessons paid for in tears, trust, and sometimes forgiveness. But before I tell you what really happened that Mother's Day, have you ever wondered what makes a gentle mother turn into a woman who must fight for her own justice? That Mother's Day Sunday, I woke up at 5 in the morning. Not because I wanted to, but because at 67, sleep had become a luxury. An aching body, unpaid electricity bills, and the long stretch of loneliness all made it impossible to rest the way I used to. I sat by the window of my small house in North Minneapolis, watching Lowry Avenue slowly come to life. Old wooden houses lined both sides of the street, like old women like me, still standing but worn down by time. This house held my entire life. It was the place Marcus and I bought after 20 years of hard work. He was a factory welder. I was an accountant for a small company in Powderhorn. We weren't rich, but we were happy. I still remember snowy nights when I cradled Isaiah to sleep, listening to Marcus read the Bible in the living room. I remember him teaching our boy how to change the tire on our old Chevrolet, the two of them laughing when oil splattered all over. I remember the day Isaiah got his acceptance letter from the University of Minnesota. Marcus hugged him, tears in his eyes like a child's, and I remember the night I collapsed on the floor, clutching Marcus's photo, when a heart attack stole the man of my life. Since that day, the house had felt too big, too empty, too cold. I made a cup of peppermint tea, the cheapest kind from Dollar General, and sat staring at my old phone. Isaiah had said he'd come visit today. My son, now a successful 38-year-old businessman, ran a chain of tech companies downtown. He drove a Tesla and lived in Kenwood, where just the yearly property tax cost more than my lifetime earnings. I was proud of him, of course. I had raised him with these hands, taught him right from wrong, that honesty mattered more than money. At least, I thought I had. At 2 in the afternoon, a sleek black Tesla rolled into the driveway. I wiped my hands on my apron and forced a smile. Isaiah stepped out. Tall, handsome, crisp white shirt pressed to perfection. He held a bouquet of yellow roses, my favorite color. His smile was still warm, just like when he was little. "Mom," he said, hugging me tight. The faint scent of expensive cologne lingered around his collar, a scent unfamiliar, far from the ivory soap I once used on him. "My boy," I said, wrapping my arms around him. My heart pounded. Joy and unease tangled together. Something felt off, though I couldn't name it. We went inside. Isaiah placed the flowers on the table, his eyes scanning the room, the broken heater, the peeling paint, the faded curtains. "Mom, you still haven't fixed the heater?" he asked softly. I forced a chuckle. "Oh, I'm saving up." I made it through last winter just fine. Fine, with 3 sweaters and a kettle of hot water to soak my feet each night. But I didn't tell him that. Isaiah sat in Marcus's old chair, the one where he used to read the newspaper. His gaze was gentle, yet distant. That distance wasn't measured in feet, but in class, in pace, in life, between the rich and the left behind. "Mom," he said carefully, "Clarissa's still been giving you the money, right? $5,000 a month. I just want to make sure you're comfortable." Time froze. $5,000 every month. My heart raced. The room spun. $5,000? I stammered. "Yeah, Mom," he said. "I set up an automatic transfer 8 months ago. $5,000 each month. Clarissa said she's been bringing it to you, either in cash or to deposit. You didn't get it? 8 months, $5,000 a month, $40,000. Enough to fix the roof, replace the heater, buy fresh groceries. Enough so I wouldn't have to stand in line for charity food. But I hadn't seen a single dime. Son, I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I've been living off donations from the Pilgrim Baptist Church, sweetheart. Isaiah's smile vanished. He stared at me, confused. That's impossible. The transfers go through every 15th. Clarissa said, Isaiah! A cheerful voice cut him off. The door burst open. I'd forgotten to lock it. Clarissa Ward walked in like she was stepping onto a red carpet. 32 years old, tall, slim, her golden hair falling in soft waves over a cream silk dress that hugged every curve. Silver heels gleamed in the afternoon light. And that scent, Chanel No. 5, rich, proud, filling the small house and smothering the aroma of the apple pie I'd baked for my son. Mother Mavis, she sang, kissing the air beside both my cheeks without touching skin. You look wonderful. I've missed you so much. I stood there, dazed. Not by the perfume, by the contrast. I wore an old patched sweater. She was draped in something worth more than my 3-month electric bill. Isaiah rose, his voice tense. Clarissa, Mom says she hasn't received a cent. Not one. For 8 months, Clarissa blinked, the perfect picture of surprise. Oh my goodness, there must be some mix-up. Mother Mavis, you must have forgotten. I've been bringing the money every month, and the cookies too, remember? She tilted her head, her voice sugary but sharp as glass. Old age. The memory just isn't what it used to be, right? I heard every word. Old age. Bad memory. Each one pierced my heart like a needle made of ice. The room went dead silent. Only the grandfather clock ticked, 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 as if counting down to something breaking. In that moment, I saw my reflection in the mirror, a small, frail woman with silver hair and fading eyes, but still, eyes that burned with clarity. I had heard this all my life, from bank clerks, from doctors, from people who thought age meant confusion and weakness. But I remembered everything, every bill, every prayer, every face at church. And I knew one thing for certain. Clarissa had never given me a single dollar. I stayed still. Isaiah looked between us, torn. Mom? Are you sure you're not mistaken? In the small room, afternoon light filtered through the window. I had a choice. I could speak the truth, accuse Clarissa right then and there, ruin Mother's Day in a storm of shouting. Or I could stay silent, watch, remember. 30 years as an accountant taught me one thing: numbers never lie. People do. I smiled and nodded. Maybe I did forget. Old age, you know. Just like you said, Clarissa exhaled, so softly most wouldn't notice. But I did. Isaiah placed a hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, Mom. I'll double-check. I just want you to be comfortable. I nodded, poured him some orange juice. But inside, a silent storm was forming. Some battles don't begin with shouting. They begin with silence. And I'd spent a lifetime learning how to wait. By the time they left, the sun had set. I stood at the door, waving as the Tesla disappeared into the dusk. Then I sat at the kitchen table, poured a cup of cold tea, and stared at my reflection in the glass. A thin, lonely old woman, but with fire still burning in her eyes. $40,000, enough to live out my old age, now in someone else's hands. I pressed my palm against my chest, not out of anger, but pain. That night, I opened my old notebook, once filled with grocery lists and prayers. But this time, I wrote something different. Find the truth. Never trust fake tears. I closed the book and took a deep breath. I wasn't weak. I had survived loss, loneliness, and poverty, and I'd survive this too. Isaiah might be fooled, but I wouldn't be. And if Clarissa thought I'd sit quietly while she played perfect, she had chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. Have you ever let someone belittle your memory just because you stayed silent? Don't look away, because in the next part, I'll tell you how I quietly turned silence into my weapon. The next morning, I didn't go to church as usual. Instead, I sat in the kitchen in front of the old computer, a gift from Isaiah 5 years ago, outdated but still working. I opened the U.S. Bank website, logged in, and waited. My fingers trembled. Every click echoed like a heartbeat. I checked every line, every transaction. Nothing. No transfers from Isaiah Grant. No $5,000. Nothing but $1.35 of interest from February. I printed the statement. White paper, black ink. Cold and unforgiving. That was the first piece of evidence. Proof that I wasn't mistaken, forgetful, or crazy. But I knew this was only the beginning. That afternoon, I put on my neatest wool coat and took bus number 14 to the U.S. Bank branch on Nicollet Mall. May in Minneapolis was heartbreakingly beautiful. Blue skies, golden sunlight, people strolling and laughing. But to me, this city no longer felt like mine. It belonged to people like Clarissa. Silk dresses, designer bags, luxury cars, glass houses gleaming in the sun. And me? I belonged to North Minneapolis, where the sound of sirens sometimes replaced lullabies, where old wooden homes still stood despite being eaten away by time. I stepped into the bank, bright fluorescent lights. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly printed documents. People walked past me as if I were invisible. I approached the counter. A young teller named Amy gave me a polite smile. "Hello, ma'am. How can I help you today?" I handed her my book. "My son said he's been transferring money to me, $5,000 a month. It's been 8 months now," Amy typed for a moment, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grant. There haven't been any transactions from an Isaiah Grant. Only $1.35 of interest." I nodded, thanked her, and stepped outside. The wind was strong. I stood on the street, watching people pass by, feeling as if I'd fallen into a bottomless pit. No money, no letters, no messages. For 8 months, I'd lived on charity food, clipped coupons, and told myself, he's busy. He must have forgotten. But now, I knew. Someone was lying. That afternoon, I went to Pilgrim Baptist Church as usual. After the service, Pastor Samuel Dorsey saw me sitting quietly in the back row and came over. "Sister Mavis, you look tired. Is something wrong?" I smiled, hiding my trembling hands. I'm just trying to understand why my son's letters never reach me anymore. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. The Lord will bring the truth to light. Don't lose faith. I nodded, but inside, I felt differently. This time, faith wasn't enough. I needed action. That night, I opened my brown leather notebook, a birthday gift from Isaiah when I turned 60. On the first page, I wrote, "If they lie, I'll make them speak the truth, through the law." The pen pressed deep into the paper. Under the lamplight, the words gleamed like a vow. From that day on, I began recording everything. June 14th. Clarissa brought pastries, said, "The money's sent, Mother. The bank must be slow. No envelope, no proof." July 12th. She called, said she was in a charity meeting. Background noise, restaurant music. August 22nd. She brought lavender flowers, new dress, said, "There's a bank issue." When I told her I'd already asked the bank, she froze, then left quickly. Line by line, I wrote it all down. No anger, no hatred, only the cold precision of an old accountant who knew numbers never lie. One August afternoon, I was watering the garden when a white Mercedes glided into the driveway. Clarissa stepped out, fragrant, glowing, holding a bunch of lavender. "Mother, I brought you flowers. Stress isn't good for memory, you know." I set the watering can down, wiped my hands. "My memory's just fine, Clarissa. Fine enough to remember that the last time you brought me any money was never." Her face froze for a second. Then she smiled again, syrupy sweet. "Oh, Mother, you must be mistaken. I've been sending it. It's just a bank glitch." I smiled softly. "Maybe so. But I checked with the bank. They said there haven't been any transfers in 8 months." Silence. Even the sparrows stopped chirping. Clarissa fiddled with the pearl on her necklace, her voice faltering. I'll look into it." Then she turned and hurried away. The click of her heels on the wooden porch sounded like a countdown to the collapse of a lie. The car door slammed, the engine roared, the Lexus vanished down the street, leaving behind harsh sunlight and the truth. I stood there watching, a strange mix of pain and clarity washing over me. She had lied, and now she knew I knew. If you discovered a family member embezzling your own money, what would you do? Stay silent and hope they confess, or quietly set the trap yourself? Because I, a mother, an accountant, and a widow, was about to turn cold numbers into weapons, and every mistake they made, I would make sure it appeared, line by line, statement by statement. That night I wrote, August 22nd. Clarissa lied, anxious, left early. Each word landed like a hammer strike to my heart. I was no longer the old woman praying quietly in the back pew. I was Mavis Grant, a woman who had survived loss, debt, and hollow promises, and I would survive again to reclaim the truth. In the weeks that followed, I contacted Isaiah's bank, pretending to ask about gift transfers. They didn't say much, but one kind employee hinted, if the money was sent, it would go into an account in your name. If it doesn't show, maybe someone's using another account under your name. Those words chilled me to the bone. Another account. In my name, but not mine. Clarissa was smart, charming, manipulative. But I had been an accountant for 3 companies. I had managed thousands of dollars without losing a cent. If someone dared forge my name, I would find them. That night, I stared at the notebook, the lamplight casting over shaky but steady handwriting. Between the lines, I could almost see Marcus's face. He used to say, "Mavis, if someone underestimates you, don't shout. Let them hear the voice of truth." Instead, I closed the book, feeling an odd peace. The next morning, I returned to church, carrying an envelope filled with copies of my notes. I handed it to Pastor Dorsey and whispered, "If one day I can't make it here, please keep this safe for me." He frowned with worry. "Sister Mavis, what are you planning to do?" I only smiled. I'm just preparing for the truth to be heard. On my way home, the breeze was cool and gentle. I felt lighter. I knew the road ahead would bring tears, betrayal, and pain, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I would reclaim every dollar. But more than that, I would reclaim the respect they thought I'd lost with age. As evening fell, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset burn crimson behind the oak trees. In that glow, I whispered, "Clarissa, you chose the wrong woman to deceive, and this old mother still has a few lessons left to teach you." I smiled, closed the notebook, and wrote the final line at the corner of the page. The first step toward justice is memory. In the Minnesota dusk, I knew my fight had only just begun. That morning, I was cutting lavender to dry when there was a knock at the door. Not the gentle tap of a mailman or a neighbor. This was steady, deliberate, purposeful. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair, a charcoal suit wrinkled slightly from travel. He smiled politely and gave a small nod. "Mrs. Mavis Grant?" "I'm Henry Lawson, chief accountant at your son's firm, Grant and Associates." I frowned. "Mr. Lawson?" "I only know Sandra, the accountant I spoke to on the phone." He nodded. "Yes, Sandra is my assistant. She told me about your call yesterday, and I thought, there are a few things you should probably know." His voice was calm and serious, tinged with regret. I invited him in and poured a glass of water. Morning light slanted through the window, casting shadows across his face, the face of a man who had seen more than he wished. He set a leather briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was a thick folder, clipped tight and neatly organized. I saw crisp printed lines and columns of figures. The familiar language of accounting, my world for 30 years before I retired. He slid the folder toward me and spoke slowly. "These are copies of 8 wire transfers, each for $5,000. Total, $40,000. The recipient, an account under the name Clarissa Ward." It was like a bucket of ice water thrown over me. My hands trembled as I turned each page. Everything was clear. Sender, Isaiah Grant. Recipient, Clarissa Ward. Bank confirmations, same day each month, as regular as clockwork, for 8 months. I looked up, my voice catching. "Mr. Lawson, who opened this account?" He sighed and removed his glasses to wipe them. "Your daughter-in-law, Mrs. Grant." All the documents for the secondary account bear her signature, along with a power of attorney signed by Isaiah First. Froze. "Power of attorney? You mean Isaiah authorized her to use my name?" He nodded. "Most likely your son didn't read the forms closely. She presented a copy of your ID. I suspect it's forged and quite sophisticated. The system recorded it as your account, even though the real beneficiary is her." I pressed a hand to my forehead. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. For 8 months, Clarissa had used my name, a mother's name, to siphon money from my own son. "And Isaiah?" I asked quietly. "Does my boy know?" Henry Lawson hesitated before answering. "Honestly, I don't think so. Isaiah works very hard, but he trusts too easily. He lets Clarissa handle most of the paperwork." He paused, then looked me straight in the eye. "And she's also been using the company credit card for personal expenses." I stared at him. "The company card?" "Yes. Grant and Associates corporate card, meant for clients and business costs. But recently we've found numerous irregular charges: spa treatments, jewelry, clothing, even first-class airfare to New York. Over $30,000 in 3 months." I sat in silence. The words spa, jewelry, airfare rang in my head like a hammer on steel. I turned to the window. Morning sunlight fell across the wooden chair where Clarissa had once sat sipping tea. Chattering about work, I remembered clearly what she'd said. "Mother, Isaiah's so busy. I handle everything for him. Now I understood that everything meant every last dollar. I faced Henry again, my voice hoarse but firm. Mr. Lawson, if I want to expose this, will you help me? He held my gaze. Steady, gray-blue eyes. Mrs. Grant, I believe in justice, but I also believe in evidence. We must prepare carefully. If we don't, she'll spin the story and turn Isaiah against you. Clarissa is not an easy opponent. I nodded. I know. I've seen her do it, smiling while she lies. Henry gave a thin, sober smile. I'll help. But give me a few days to gather everything. Transaction histories, related documents, and written confirmation from the bank that the account isn't yours. It'll take some time, but I promise we'll have the truth. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Integrity. Thank you, Mr. Lawson, I said softly. You don't know what this means to me. He closed the folder and stood. I'm only doing what's right, Mrs. Grant. And, I'm sorry to say it, but cases like yours happen more often than you think. Many are betrayed by those closest to them. I nodded, my eyes resting on a family photo on the wall. Isaiah at 10, grinning beside his father. I remembered the light drizzle that day, and Marcus saying, Teach him the difference between a good man and a liar, Mavis. They often wear the same smile. After Henry left, leaving me alone with the stack of papers on the table, the door creaked shut and the house fell back into silence. I stared at the thick folder. Each transfer line was a puzzle piece of betrayal. Carefully, I placed everything into a small metal box and slid it under the cabinet. As I turned the key, it felt like locking the last door of trust. Afternoon settled in, sunlight spilling across the porch and catching in my silver hair. I brewed a cup of black tea and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at the garden, the lavender swaying gently. Outside was peace. Inside me, a quiet flame. I opened my notebook and wrote slowly, steadily. September 11th. Henry Lawson came, brought records of 8 transfers, each for $5,000, into an account under the name Clarissa Ward. Clarissa used the company card for personal spending. Isaiah was deceived, not only out of my money, but his as well. I have an ally. The fight begins. I set down my pen and looked up at the sky. It burned red like a streak of fire tearing the clouds. In a low, steady voice, I said, Clarissa, you forgot I did accounting for 40 years. I can read lies in numbers, and this time the numbers will speak for me. I closed the notebook and felt lighter. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. There was a witness now, someone standing with me. That night, I slept better than usual. The crickets outside kept time like the beat of hope. In my dreams, I saw Henry standing in a white beam of light, holding the folder high, Clarissa backing away, her face draining as each secret was unveiled. And when I woke, I knew. I was no longer a victim. I was the one setting the truth in motion. If you've just gotten proof a liar can't wriggle past, what would you do? Charge in head-on or lay a quiet snare and let them step into it themselves? I chose the latter, because some confessions only crack open when the liar says the words with their own mouth. 3 days later, when every fact was sorted neatly in my mind like lines on a balance sheet, I decided to act. I called Isaiah. My son's voice was warm and familiar, tinged with fatigue. Mom, I've been so busy lately. Clarissa says she's been visiting you regularly, right? I smiled and kept my tone light. Yes, dear. Clarissa's very thoughtful. I was thinking of inviting you both over for dinner this Sunday. It's been a while since we've had a proper family meal. Isaiah agreed immediately, never noticing the fine thread hidden in the invitation. I spent all Sunday morning preparing, not to make a perfect dinner, but to make it look as ordinary as possible. honey roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, apple walnut salad, apple pie, the dishes Isaiah loved since childhood. I polished Marcus's old silver set and laid the table by soft candlelight, everything warm, sincere, just enough to lower a liar's guard. At 6, the familiar hum of an engine sounded at the gate. A silver Lexus glided in. Clarissa stepped out first, flawless as ever, waved hair, jade silk dress, a hint of Dior in the air. Isaiah followed, carrying white lilies. "Mom, you look great." Isaiah smiled, placing the flowers on the table. "My dear, I'm better than ever, by God's grace. And thanks to you too." Clarissa's smile curled in that familiar, self-satisfied way. I recognized that look. The look of someone who believes she's pulling every string. I poured wine and tea, chatting about small things, the weather, the lavender, the new neighbors down the street. Everything flowed smoothly, as if suspicion had never crossed this threshold. I let the room grow warm, let her relax. When the main course was served, I looked up and smiled. "I'm so grateful to you both, especially for the $5,000 this month. Clarissa, you're very thoughtful." Clarissa paused half a beat, then flashed a dazzling smile and took a sip of wine. "Oh, Mother, don't mention it." "I'm only doing what I should." I nodded, feigning shyness. "You're very kind." I'm glad I could buy the new heater. Minnesota gets cold early. That helped me feel much more at ease. Clarissa's smile grew wider, smug. She tilted her head toward Isaiah, as if to say, "See? Everything's fine." I watched her slowly, then asked as if offhand, "By the way, Clarissa, what day do you usually send it?" She wasn't prepared. The answer slipped out by reflex. "The 10th of each month, Mother." I nodded slightly. But before I could speak, Isaiah jumped in, a little confused. "Wait, it's not the 10th, honey." I set the automatic transfer for the 15th. The room went still. Do you hear that silence? The moment a liar stumbles into her own trap? They looked at each other. Clarissa tried to laugh, blinking rapidly. Isaiah frowned, tilting his head. "Really? I thought it was the 10th. Then his frown deepened. "No, I'm sure it's the 15th. I picked that date because that's when my salary hits." The air cooled to ice. I smiled and set my fork down. "Oh, that's perfect. I'll stop by the bank on the 15th, just to make sure the system isn't acting up." Clarissa laughed a little too brightly, smothering her unease. "Oh, Mother, you're so careful." "Don't worry, I've been sending it regularly." Isaiah nodded, but his eyes had changed. He turned to say something to his wife. She quickly shifted the topic to work and the weather. I sat still, observing. Inside me was a glass-clear calm, the calm of a trap laid in exactly the right place. And from that moment, I knew. Clarissa had begun to lose control. Now I only had to wait for her to dismantle her own plan. After dinner, I brought out dessert, a crisp apple pie, cinnamon scent drifting through the room. Isaiah praised it to the skies. Clarissa barely touched hers, eyes flicking to her watch as if she couldn't wait to leave. I knew she was trying to breathe inside the very room she thought she controlled. At the door, I said gently, "Thank you both for coming." It's been a long time since I've laughed this much. I paused, looking straight into Clarissa's eyes. "Remember, on the 15th, I'll check the account, just to be sure the bank system isn't acting up." Clarissa forced the corner of her mouth up. "Yes, Mother." "I'm sure there won't be any problem." Isaiah kissed my cheek. His gaze was as tender as always, but beneath it ran a fine hairline crack of doubt. As the Lexus backed out, I stood in the doorway watching the taillights blur. The night wind crossed the yard and made the wooden door tremble softly. I closed the door and went back inside. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. I walked straight to the small office off the kitchen and turned on the computer. The screen light washed over Marcus's photo. His gentle smile seemed to nudge me one step further. I opened my email and wrote to the only two people I trusted now. Henry Lawson, the principal accountant, and Camille Porter, an old college friend who now specialized in financial fraud. I typed slowly, heartbeat steady, mind clear as glass. Subject: It's time to begin. Henry, Camille, everything is ready. I just confirmed that Clarissa lied about the transfer date. They contradicted each other right in front of me. They think I believe them, but they've exposed themselves. I want us to move forward as planned. Please start reviewing all transactions and prepare the reconciliation file. Before the 15th, I need every piece of evidence arranged neatly. It's time to let her destroy herself. Mavis. I reread the last line and smiled faintly. The phrase, destroy herself, eased me. Not out of revenge, but because justice would come from the liar's own mouth. I hit send and leaned back. Outside, the night wind stirred the curtains. Jasmine and damp earth slipped in. I closed my eyes and listened to the clock ticking. A countdown to the 15th. If it were you, once the trap was set, would you confront them at once, or sit still and let the liar cinch the knot herself? I chose the latter, because there was still one final piece, black and white on paper. 2 days later, Henry replied, brief and to the point, just his style. I have confirmation from the bank. The account in your name was opened by Clarissa using forged documents. They'll release data once we have a court order. Camille will handle that. Everything is on track. H. When I finished reading, my chest tightened and then eased, like hearing an old iron gate creak open. I wasn't being cruel. I only wanted the truth to speak, so my son would wake up. I wanted Isaiah to understand. Trust is not a blank check for someone to drain an account dry. That night, I opened my notebook and added one line. A familiar ritual. September 13th, perfect dinner. Clarissa exposed herself. Isaiah beginning to doubt. The 15th, bank check. Justice approaching, light as the wind. I closed the notebook and blew out the candle. In the dark, moonlight fell across my face through the window. Looking in the mirror, I saw a small, silver-haired woman whose eyes were still bright. I whispered, to myself or to Marcus, either would do, Marcus, do you see? She thought she was clever, but with her own mouth she tightened the noose. All I have to do is stay quiet and wait for the 15th. I smiled the smallest smile, warm enough to fill the room. The trap was set. The prey was stepping in. The next morning, the Minnesota sky was startlingly clear. I sat by the window with a hot cup of jasmine tea, strangely calm. Today was the day Henry had promised to send everything. In just a few hours, every lie would take shape. Black ink on white paper. Around 8, the phone rang. Henry Lawson. Mrs. Grant, his voice low and steady. It's done. I've just sent you the full statements with related invoices. Camille reviewed them and says with your signature, we can open a case. I thanked him, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I never imagined at my age I'd need an accountant and a lawyer just to protect the money my son meant for me. 15 minutes later, the mailman knocked. A large manila envelope stamped, Confidential, Hayes Financial Records. I set it on the table, stared for a long while, then opened it. Inside were dozens of clean printouts. 8 transfers, each $5,000. Total $40,000. Sender, Isaiah Grant. Recipient, Clarissa Ward. Bold, even type on official bank paper. I read it twice and still couldn't believe it, as if the numbers were mocking my trust. On the last page, in Henry's blue ink, Mrs. Grant, Clarissa used this account as a personal account. Beyond the 8 transfers, there are charges on a secondary card, spa, shopping, travel, deposit on a new car. 8-month total, $47,800. I sat motionless. Morning light filtered through the curtains, laying a pale gold over the stack, the color of truth. I turned the page. Houston Spa invoice, $1,200. Cancun travel for 2, $3,600. Deposit on a new Lexus, $15,000. Each receipt was a small knife. I remembered her stepping into my house, fragrant, polished, arms full of gifts, saying sweetly, "Mother, I just want you to know I care for you like my own." Now I understood that care meant draining every dollar under my name. I sat for a long time, breathed deep. Then I reached for the brown leather notebook. I call it the Justice Journal. Under the date, I wrote each word clearly. September 17th, received Henry's files. 8 transfers of $5,000, all into Clarissa's hands. Spa, travel, new car, $47,800. That is the price of trust. My hands trembled, not from fear, but because I was about to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen. That afternoon, Camille called. Her voice was firm and precise, the kind you hear coming out of many courtrooms. "Mavis, I've reviewed everything Henry sent. Rock solid. This is a textbook case of elder financial exploitation. We can go criminal or civil. Your choice?" I paused a beat, then spoke softly. "Not yet. I don't want the court to see it before Isaiah does. He needs to witness it with his own eyes. Only then will justice mean something." Camille was silent for a few seconds, then said slowly, "You're right. Nothing hurts like a man realizing his wife exploited his mother's trust." I nodded. "That's why I want Pastor Dorsey to help stage a small fundraising evening, an excuse to get them here." Camille gave a soft, knowing laugh. "A set-piece evening for exposure. Smart, Mavis. I'll have Henry pull a summary, something Isaiah can't refute." Near sunset, I drove to Pilgrim Baptist. Red evening light washed over the old stone steps. Pastor Dorsey was setting up chairs in the hall. After hearing the plan, he pondered, then smiled kindly. "Sometimes God doesn't need thunder to reveal a sin, Mavis. He only needs a small light of truth." I squeezed his hand, grateful. I only want Isaiah to see that light. Not for revenge, but so he'll stop being blind. On the way home, I stopped at the corner store to pick up a few things for the evening I was arranging. Outside was peaceful. No one would suspect that in just a few days, Clarissa's entire world would collapse. That night, I spread all of Henry's documents across the dining table. Every statement, every receipt, every scrap of evidence. I used a red pen to mark the large withdrawals, then clipped everything into a beige envelope. On the front, I carefully wrote, "Fundraising materials, Elder Support Fund." Only I knew there were no fundraising materials inside, only guilt and lies. I sat looking at the stack for a long time. My hands still shook, not from fear of retaliation, but because my heart had started beating strong again after months of numbness. For a long time, I thought I was just a simple widow who needed taking care of. But looking at the evidence, I understood. I had never been weak. I had only been persuaded to believe I was. I stood, poured a glass of water, and looked out at the backyard. The night sky was full of stars, so still I could hear the crickets between gusts of wind. I remembered Marcus's words. "If someone hurts you, don't pray for their apology." "Make them see themselves in the mirror," I whispered. "I'm about to do just that." And now, all that remained was to wait. Wait for the 15th. The day when Clarissa would have nowhere left to hide from the truth. The 15th arrived like a sentence no one could escape. I got up at 5 a.m., not from worry, but from a strange flutter. Like standing before a door I had waited 8 months to open. The Minneapolis sky was still dark, but something in the air told me today would be different. I brewed tea and sat by the window, watching streetlights reflect on dew-wet sidewalks. In my hand was a beige envelope, heavy not with paper, but with the truth inside. At exactly 9, I put on my best wool coat, still old, still mended, but clean and dignified, then took the bus to the U.S. Bank on Nicollet Mall. This time, I didn't go alone. Henry Lawson was waiting by the bank entrance, back straight in a gray suit, the familiar leather briefcase in hand. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, a wordless gesture of respect. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for 8 months," I replied. We went in. This time we weren't greeted by the young teller Amy, but by a senior manager named Richard Chen, someone Henry had contacted in advance. Mr. Chen led us into a private room, glass walls and soundproofing making the space feel both discreet and cold. "Mrs. Grant," he said, pulling up records on his screen, voice professional but eyes faintly sympathetic. "Per Mr. Lawson's request, we've verified everything. In fact, in January last year, a secondary account was opened under your name." My heart pounded. "Who opened the account?" "Clarissa Ward. She presented copies of your identification and a power of attorney form with your signature." "I never signed that," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He nodded. "We compared it with your original signature. The differences are clear. This is forgery." He printed a sheet and slid it across the table. "Account number XXXXXX1847. Account holder Mavis E. Grant. Forged. Actual controller Clarissa L. Ward." I looked at the paper the way one looks at a death warrant. Not for me, for Clarissa. "Will the bank testify in court?" Henry asked. "Yes. With a court order, we will provide the full records," Mr. Chen said, nodding. I took the paper, thanked him, and stepped outside. Sunlight on Nicollet Mall was blinding. Towers gleamed. People hurried by with shopping bags and coffee cups. And my world stood still. I had it. The final piece. Irrefutable. No room left for excuses. "You all right?" Henry asked quietly. I nodded, but tears spilled. Not from sorrow, but from release. "I'm not crazy," I whispered. "I didn't forget." I wasn't mistaken. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You were never crazy, Mrs. Grant. You were deceived by someone who should have protected you." We stood there a moment amid the stream of passers-by, an old accountant and a principled ally, holding the truth in our hands. That evening, I called Isaiah. "Son," I said, my voice strangely calm, "this Saturday night, come to Pilgrim Baptist. Pastor Dorsey is hosting a small fundraiser for the elderly. I want you and Clarissa there." Isaiah agreed at once. "Of course, Mom. We'd be happy to come." After I hung up, I sat in the dark. No sense of triumph, only a cold resolve. Saturday came, crisp in the air. Minnesota autumn had edged in. I arrived at the church at 6. The small hall was simply set. Rows of folding chairs, a tea table in the corner, a lectern up front. Pastor Dorsey greeted me. "Everything's ready, Mavis." "Camille and Henry are here too." I nodded, heart thudding like a drum. A few community members had gathered, familiar elders from church, a few volunteers. They believed it was a typical fundraiser. Only 4 people knew the truth: me, Henry, Camille, and Pastor Dorsey. At 7 sharp, a silver Lexus slid into the lot. Isaiah stepped out in a white shirt, tired but smiling. Clarissa followed, perfect as ever. Cream dress, nude heels, hair neatly tied back. When she walked in, heads turned. Not in admiration, but at the contrast. Clarissa gleaming, upscale, perfumed. Everyone else, worn dresses, patched sweaters, folks living on donated groceries. That contrast spoke volumes on its own. "Mom!" Isaiah hugged me. "I didn't know you were involved in charity." "There are many things you don't know about me, son," I said softly. Clarissa air-kissed my cheeks. "Mother Mavis, you're amazing. Always helping others." "Yes," I smiled thinly, "and sometimes others help me." Pastor Dorsey opened with a brief prayer, then introduced me. Tonight, we'll hear from Sister Mavis Grant, a woman who shows us the true meaning of courage. I stood, walked to the lectern, envelope in hand. The room fell silent. Isaiah looked at me with proud eyes. Clarissa tilted her head, confidence intact. I drew a breath. Thank you, Pastor. Tonight, I'm not here to talk about charity. I'm here to talk about the truth. The air shifted. People sat up straighter. 8 months ago, my son, Isaiah, began sending me $5,000 a month. He wanted his mother to live comfortably. I paused, looking directly at Clarissa. But I never received a single cent. Gasps rippled through the room. Isaiah sprang up. Mom, what are you saying? I opened the envelope and drew out the first sheet. This is the U.S. bank statement, confirming there were no deposits into my account. I handed it to Isaiah. His hands shook. And this, I pulled the second sheet, is the statement showing where the money went, into an account bearing my name, but controlled by Clarissa. The room held its breath. Clarissa shot to her feet, face blanched. This is a misunderstanding. Mother Mavis, It's not a misunderstanding, Henry's low voice cut in. He rose from the back row. I'm the chief accountant at your son's firm. I verified every transaction. Camille Porter stood as well, voice sharp as a blade. I'm Mrs. Grant's attorney. We have sufficient evidence of financial fraud and forged signatures. Clarissa turned to Isaiah, tears streaming. You don't believe them, do you? Baby, this is a setup to ruin me. But Isaiah wasn't looking at her. He looked at me, his silver-haired mother in old clothes, eyes bright with the fire of truth. Mom, his voice broke, why didn't you tell me? Because you wouldn't have believed me, son, I said gently. You love your wife. And sometimes, love blinds us. I handed him the full file. Here's all of it. Spa, $1,200. Cancun, trip, $3,600. Lexus deposit, $15,000. Total $47,800. All from the money meant for your mother. Isaiah trembled as he flipped through the pages, sweat beading on his forehead. Clarissa wailed, I didn't mean to. I only borrowed it. I was going to pay it back. Borrowed? Isaiah's voice cracked like thunder. For 8 months? By forging my mother's signature? His hand slammed the chair. The room shook. What did you do to my mother? What did you do to us? Clarissa staggered back, mascara streaking, but no one moved toward her. Pastor Dorsey rose, voice calm. Sometimes God doesn't need to punish. He simply lets a person see themselves. I looked at Clarissa, the once assured woman, now in shards. I don't need that money, I said slowly. I need respect. And you took it, not only from me, but from your husband. Clarissa burst into sobs, stammering, I'm sorry. I can't. She grabbed her purse and ran for the doors. Her heels hammered the floor, then faded. The doors slammed. Silence fell. No more crying, no more excuses, only the truth, heavy in the room. Isaiah stood motionless, head bowed, shoulders shaking. I stepped to him and cupped his cheek. I'm not angry with you, my son. I just wanted you to wake up. He held me tight and wept like a child. And I did not cry. Because finally, after 8 months, justice had come. That night, when everyone had gone, I stood alone in the empty hall. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass. I whispered, It's done. The curtain had fallen. That night, the rain fell from dusk till midnight. Wind lashed against the windows, rattling the lavender pots I had brought in earlier. The warm lamplight reflected on the wet glass, glimmering like the fragments of memories I was piecing back together. I sat by the window, reviewing donation files for next week's Grace Hands meeting when I heard a knock, soft but firm, carrying the chill of the storm. I looked up. Almost 10 p.m. At my age, few people knock this late. Unless... I walked to the door, hand trembling slightly as I turned the latch. The door swung open. Wind rushed in, rain splattering on my sleeves. And there he was, standing in the downpour. Isaiah. My son was drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes red and tired. For a moment, time stopped. The boy I once cradled, the child I taught to tie his shoes, now stood before me, trembling, like a man who had been lost too long and finally found his way home. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was so foolish." Before I could respond, he stepped in and collapsed onto the wooden floor, still slick with rainwater. His sobs came raw, unfiltered. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I stood still, looking at the son who once thought he knew everything, now shattered in the same home where he'd first learned what honesty meant. I knelt beside him, laid my hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "Isaiah, stand up, son." Everyone stumbles. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's how we save ourselves. He looked up, tears mingling with the rain. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Mom. I doubted you, let my wife control me, stayed silent while you suffered. Mom, I've lost everything." I shook my head, guided him to the sofa, and gently dried his hair, just as I used to when he was little. Every motion slow and tender, afraid that haste might break this fragile moment of reconciliation. "Son, I don't need an apology. I just need you to remember, truth never arrives late. It only waits until we're brave enough to face it." He stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass like the belated heartbeat of a soul awakening. After a long silence, he murmured, "Clarissa's gone, Mom." I paused. He continued. She had emptied the accounts, taken the last of the company funds, and vanished with an old lover. I wasn't angry, nor surprised, just quietly sad, like the sky resigned to the storm's end. He whispered, voice trembling. "I called, I texted, I searched everywhere. She left only one message. You trusted the wrong person." I took his hand, warm and firm. "No, you didn't trust the wrong person. You just found the truth too late. Even broken trust still defines us. It's what separates us from those who deceive." He leaned against my shoulder, breathing hard, but alive again. Then came a sob, small and human. "I've lost everything, Mom. Career, money, dignity." I stroked his hair, calm. "No, son. What you found tonight is greater. A heart that knows remorse." The rain lasted past midnight. I made him ginger tea. The heat mingled with the scent of burning wood, filling the room with quiet warmth. "How can you be so calm after everything?" he asked. "Because I know justice isn't about making someone pay. It's about restoring balance. Clarissa is reaping what she sowed." He nodded, eyes reflecting the dancing firelight. "All I have left is you." "No, son. You still have yourself. What you do next will decide whether you truly stand up again." Then, softly but surely, he said, "Mom, can I help with your foundation?" "I want to do something meaningful. Start this weekend." I looked at him, sincerity shining through his exhaustion. "You're sure?" "Yes. I don't want to live like before. I want to learn how to use money to heal, not to harm." From that weekend on, Isaiah came to the foundation every week, bringing coffee, setting up chairs, writing thank you letters. People say time heals all wounds, but for me, it was his change that did. One morning, I saw him bent over a spreadsheet, hair catching the sunlight. For a moment, he was that little boy again, the one who once asked, "Mom, what does honesty mean?" I called softly, "Isaiah." "Yes, Mom." "You've walked through your pain, son." "Not everyone can do that." He smiled. A real smile, one I hadn't seen in years. If it weren't for you, I'd still be drowning in guilt. No, son. I didn't save you. You saved yourself. Outside, a spring drizzle began to fall. The door that once echoed a storm's knock now stood open. No rain poured in, only wind and lavender. In that stillness, I understood. Life, no matter how broken, always leaves a door open for those who wish to return. I no longer feared poverty. The soup lines were behind me, and I wasn't ashamed to remember them. I was grateful. They taught me the dignity of patience. There is something more precious than money, self-respect. As long as you keep that, you have not truly lost. Each morning, I still brew tea and open the window for sunlight. It falls across the photo of my husband and me. Marcus, in his white shirt, arm around my shoulders, eyes kind. I smile at him. If you were here, you'd be proud of me, wouldn't you? And I know he would be. Not for the money I reclaimed, but because I never let anyone define my worth. That night, I opened the same brown leather journal and wrote the final line. The thief is gone. But the lesson remains. I closed it, listening to the church bells echo in the rain. Slow, deep, like time itself breathing. No revenge, no applause, just peace. The kind that comes when you know honesty still has a place in the world. I whispered into the candlelight, "Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you for taking everything, so I could learn the most important thing. It's not about holding on, but about standing up." 1 year later, Minnesota bloomed in spring, lavender spilling over the porch, sky soft as silk. I was making tea when the phone rang, a call from Austin. "Mrs. Mavis Grant, congratulations. You've been selected as Minnesota Woman of the Year for your contributions to social justice and senior rights." I stood silent. A year ago, I was a 67-year-old widow living on food donations. Now they called me a symbol of quiet justice. Turns out, when you stand by the truth, life finds its way back to you. The ceremony was held at the Hennepin County Courthouse. I chose a pale blue dress, simple, like my life now. As I stepped on stage, applause rose around me. In the audience, Isaiah sat in the second row, white shirt, eyes shining with pride I hadn't seen since he was a child. Mrs. Mavis Grant, founder of Grace Hands, a woman who turned personal pain into the power of justice. I stood behind the wooden podium, voice steady. "Thank you." But today, I'm not telling my story. I'm telling the story of a mother, betrayed by her daughter-in-law, stripped of her money and her faith. The hall fell silent. I once thought silence was the best revenge, but I learned otherwise. When trust is stolen, reclaim it with truth. No shouting, no hatred, only truth. Because truth holds a power no punishment can match. Applause filled the hall, long and warm. In the front row, Isaiah wiped his eyes. I knew then. He understood. Justice doesn't live only in courtrooms. It begins the moment you have the courage to say, "Enough," even when the one who wronged you is someone you love. After the ceremony came photos, handshakes, and flowers. Stepping outside, a fine drizzle fell. Minnesota's skies always reminded me, there's light even in the rain. Isaiah draped his coat over my shoulders. "Mom, I've never seen you shine like this." I held his hand. "It's not the award, son. It's you being here and truly understanding what honesty means." He smiled through damp lashes. "I do now, and I promise to live by it." I looked up at the sky. The rain still fell, but it was no longer cold. Inside me, a small light glowed. Faith, freedom, and a new beginning. That night, I wrote one final line in my journal. A mother's greatest victory isn't in court. It's in teaching her child the worth of honesty. I closed the book, gazed at the old family photo, my husband, myself, and little Isaiah. 3 faces, 3 moments, bound by one unbroken truth. Love never dies. It only changes form. I smiled. My life isn't loud, rich, or dazzling, but it's complete, in its quiet, peaceful way. If you've stayed with me till the end, thank you. How do you see Isaiah's transformation? Have you ever had to stand up after heartbreak? Share your story below. Maybe your voice will help someone find hope tomorrow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories of truth, courage, and dignity. Because if there's one thing I've learned, dignity isn't something others give you. It's what you never let them take away.